Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Evan Weiner. Thank you, Debbie, for inviting me to the Ramsey Library. I've been at the Ramsey Library before where we did the early days of TV. My background is news and journalism. Through my career, I got to meet a lot of people, got to interact and interface with one person in particular from 1970 who used to live in Park Ridge, New Jersey. You might know him as Dick Nixon, and I got to know Richard Nixon in 1985 as he returned from his exile through baseball. And I was covering the Major League Baseball umpires, Major League Baseball owners dispute, and Richie Phillips, who is the head of the Umpires Association, and Peter Ueberroth, who is the baseball commissioner doing the negotiations, were at loggerheads, and they couldn't figure out where to go. And Richie said to Peter, he said, how about arbitration? He said, well, who do you got in mind? He says, well, how about Dick Nixon? He said, Dick Nixon? Dick Nixon, how would you get him here? He said, well, he lives up in New Jersey, and every weekend he comes down to Philadelphia. Richie lived up on off the main line in Philadelphia. And Julie and David Eisenhower were his neighbors, next door neighbors. So every weekend he got to see Dick and Pat. And so I got to know Nixon somewhat. He knew my name, I knew his name through baseball and through the umpires dispute, which he settled. And then he returned from his exile. He used to be a regular at both Shea Stadium and Yankee Stadium where I'd see him. And slowly but surely he became a senior statesman. And by 1986, 87, 1988, Nixon was back in the good graces of the media. That is Marianne Vecchio, and that was a picture taken by Kent State student of the massacre on May 4th, 1970. 1970, in some ways, was a worse year than 1968, which is always considered a major upheaval year in not only in the United States, but the world, considering what was going on in Czechoslovakia and in France in the Mexico City Olympics and the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy in the United States and Lyndon Johnson not running for re-election, Richard Nixon being elected, and Elvis coming back into prominence because Elvis did his TV special. And the reason I bring up Elvis is because Elvis has a part of the speech in 1970, or this talk in 1970. So that's Marianne Vecchio screaming for help after the Ohio State National Guard opened up fire on demonstrators at Kent State University on May 4th, 1970. That is Seattle. My daughter lives in Seattle, and my daughter lives to the left of this picture. This goes into I-5. And this was not unusual for the United States in 1970. Here are the state troopers, or the Seattle police, guarding an interstate that's going west. And the protesters here, somebody holding up a flag, an American flag upside down, blocking traffic and protesting the war in Vietnam. And there's Richard Nixon. Nixon here in May of 1970, sleepless night, deciding to go meet with the protesters in front of the White House on the Mall, trying to gauge what they were thinking of in 1970, and he was telling them what he was thinking as well in 1970. Vietnam, of course, is in the middle of everything going on in the United States. The war had really picked up in August of 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, but Americans had advisors in Vietnam in 1962 and 1963, and Johnson, after an incident with two ships, decides to declare all-out war on North Vietnam at that point. The calendar flips from 1970, but the problems from the Summer of Love, which was 1967, or 1968, or 1969, don't stop. They're there. The Vietnam War, of course, is still raging, but one war does come to an end, the Biafra War. The Middle East remains a powder keg, except in this case, the Middle East does not involve Israel. The Cold War continues, and China is looking to become friendly with the United States as well, because China and the Soviet Union aren't getting along. In the 1969 Soviet Union almost nuked China. There's Biafra. The war, of course, ends on January 15th, 1970. And you might remember this image or an image similar to that because you might remember watching on television the commercials for CARE and send money to us, and we are going to help the starving people and the children of Biafra. Biafra was in the south part of Nigeria. They decided to, some faction decided to break away from the rest of Nigeria, form their own country in 1967. The Civil War would start on July 6th, ends on January 15th, 1970. For the people of Biafra, or that region of Nigeria, Biafra represented the nationalist aspirations of the Biafran people. They felt that the leadership in the northern-dominated federal area of Nigeria no longer represented their needs. So the war starts, but by 1968, the Nigerian troops surrounded Biafra. They captured the coastal oil facilities and the city of Port Harcourt. They got a lot of help from the British. The United States, Lyndon Johnson sat on his hands. There was some limited support from Biafra, including that from Israel and some other African countries. There was a naval blockade of Port Harcourt, and that led to mass starvation of the Biafrans. About 100,000 casualties altogether from the military, and an estimated 500,000 to 2 million Biafran citizens died of starvation. And that is the short-lived flag of Biafra. There are some pockets in southern Nigeria that still want to break away as recently as 3 years ago, but nothing really has happened. The starvation, well, a lot of people died from starvation, from the blockade. Eventually, the Biafran forces would surrender to the Nigerian federal military government. Nuclear proliferation was on the minds of the Soviets and also the United States and the UN. And the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty was signed in early 1970 in March. And the purpose of the treaty was to prevent the further spread and creation of nuclear weapons and to work toward the complete disarmament of nuclear weapons country by country, and for nations to cooperate with one another in the safe development of nuclear energy. Again, Vietnam, nothing is going on. In March of 1970, Nixon had pulled some troops out, but the United States was still heavily involved in a war in the jungles in South Vietnam against North Vietnam. And as I said, August 7th, 1964, the Congress of the United States passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which authorized President Lyndon Johnson to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression by the communist government of North Vietnam. In 1970, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution would be undermined by the Senate, by Robert Dole of Kansas. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution came on the heels of an alleged attack on 2 U.S. Navy destroyers stationed off of the coast of North Vietnam, and the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution effectively launched America's full-scale involvement into the Vietnam War, which started as a civil war when it was a French colony in the 1950s. And there he is, Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon came up with the phrase, the Great Silent Majority, on November 3rd, 1969. I'm not sure if it was written for him by William Safire or Patrick Buchanan. Those were his two main speech writers at the time. And both of them, incidentally, would go into journalism after they were done with Nixon. Safire with the New York Times and Buchanan on cable TV. Buchanan had come out of newspapers. He was a op-ed writer for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. November 3rd, 1969, Richard Nixon makes his appeal to the nation, support me in Vietnam. And so tonight, to the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support. Now, a Nixon administration official would clarify what the silent majority was, and basically said it was a large and normally undemonstrative cross-section of the country that until last night November 3rd, 1969, refrained from articulating its opinions on the war. Nixon referred to the vast majority of Americans who did not take part in the mass demonstrations against the Vietnam War, nor participate in the counterculture. That's a word I've always had problems with, because I'm not sure what the counterculture was in the 1960s. A number of people might say hippies, but hippies really disappeared on October 6, 1967, the death of the hippie. The funeral of the hippie was held in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. There is no literature left over by the hippies, no ideology, nothing, except they were still referred to, or some people were still referred to as hippies in 1969-70. So they declined to participate in the counterculture and the public discourse in the country. And the people who were involved with this particular group, the silent majority, weren't necessarily the World War II veterans, who at this point were anywhere between the age of 50 and the age of 60, but also young people in the West, Midwest, and South. They kind of left out the North and the Northeast, or the corridor between the I-95 corridor between Washington and Boston, even though there were people from New York and Massachusetts and Connecticut and Rhode Island and New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Delaware and Maryland who would serve in Vietnam. But many of those people would also serve in Vietnam. And that led to other demonstrations. That is the Reverend Carl McIntyre with his wife, Fairy. And on the second anniversary of the death of Martin Luther King on April 4th, 1970, with the Bible in hand, Carl McIntyre led a demonstration for religion and also to support Vietnam. It was called the March for Victory. It went down Pennsylvania Avenue on April 4th of 1970, and McIntyre said his parade was a demonstration for military victory in Vietnam. And among the speakers there was the governor of the state of Georgia, Lester Maddox. Lester Maddox was a segregationist. He also was a racist. But there would be something he would play a part in later on in 1970 that might surprise you, because he was, as he said, a racist. He was not apologizing for being a racist either. He was a restaurant owner. He was the governor of Georgia. And he said, just in case some of you communists, socialists, and other integrationists have any doubt, the Pickrick, which was his restaurant, chicken restaurant, will never be integrated. If you want some fried chicken, it will have to be something other than Pickrick chicken. Going around at this time in 1970, Norman Lear was trying to shop around a show. The show was based on an English show on the BBC, which featured a father, a daughter, and a son-in-law who never saw eye to eye with his father-in-law on issues. The show was looked at by ABC as early as 1968 and CBS. Norman Lear got the show sold to CBS in 1970, roughly at this time. So Norman Lear, once he gets the CBS agreement done, is able to sit back and watch what is going on in the country with the silent majority, the demonstrations, and the racial division in the country. All in the Family would not make it on TV in 1970. It would make it on in January of 1971, which meant Norman Lear and his entire writing staff had the entire year to study to put into 24-minute scripts every week, featuring Archie Bunker, Michael Stivic, Gloria Stivic, and of course, Dingbat, Edith, who was in production in 1970. Now, getting back to the silent majority, and think about Archie. Many Americans, particularly working class and middle class whites, responded to the turbulence of the late 1960s, the urban riots, the anti-war protests, the alienating counterculture. Again, I'm not sure what the counterculture was, but it was there, by embracing a new kind of conservative populism. Sick of what they interpreted as spoiled hippies, the hippies were put in their grave in 1967, and whining protesters, tired of an interfering government that, in their view, according to a Nixon administration spokesperson or somebody who talked to the media, coddled poor people and black people at taxpayers' expense. These individuals form what political strategists called a silent majority. And Vietnam, they're supporting the people in Vietnam. It's April of 1970, and Richard Nixon is starting to withdraw more troops from Vietnam. On April 20th, he announced that there would be 100,000 more leaving Vietnam. When he took over the presidency in January of 1969, there were about 500,000 men and women in Vietnam. And I've been corrected during the 1960s talking about Vietnam by a woman up in Connecticut a couple of months ago, actually late in 2019. And she said, I liked your talk, but there was one thing I need to correct you with. And I said, what's that? She said, there were women in Vietnam. They may have not been the combat troops, but they were there assisting as nurses and running whatever they were running as secretaries and other things. So there were women in Vietnam, and those women in Vietnam have always been overlooked. But there were, among the 500,000 troops, women who served in the United States Army, Navy, and Air Force. April 20th, Nixon wants to pull out 100,000. 2 weeks later, the United States would invade Cambodia. That would extend the war and seemingly preclude further withdrawals. And it would also stir up a hornet's nest on many campuses across the United States, not only college kids, but high school seniors and juniors in some cases. Right there is Colombia. Cambodia is right there. I'm sorry, it's Cambodia. That's Richard Nixon. It's a Friday night, and he is trying to explain to the television audience late at night on a Friday night and assembled members of the media that the United States has no choice but to go into Cambodia to cut off supply lines from the north, there you see North Vietnam, to South, their troops stationed in South Vietnam. And they would have to temporarily extend the war into Cambodia. This does not go over well. Cambodian invasion was a series of military operations conducted in eastern Cambodia during 1970, April through June of 1970. The invasions were a policy of Nixon. 13 major operations conducted by the Army of the Republic of Vietnam between April 29th and July 22nd, and by U.S. forces over a 61-day period, May 1st through June 30th. And that stirred up action on college campuses. This is Kent State University. And I know somebody who was at Kent State, attended Kent State at the time, Steve Albert, who some basketball fans would know because he was a basketball announcer. And I've known Steve for a long, long time. He was on campus that day. And one day, I just, as a matter of fact, asked him, what do you remember about Kent State? And he just wouldn't talk about it. Just too painful for him to talk about. Just said, shrugged his shoulders, and we went on to another subject. Kent State, 4 students are killed, and there are a number of wounded as well. The shootings occur on May 4th, 1970, 5 days after Nixon's news conference. Members of the Ohio State National Guard, directed by the governor, James Rhodes, were sent to Kent State in Kent, Ohio, and they would shoot unarmed college students during a mass protest against the bombing of Cambodia by the United States military. There was some information that the students were armed. 28 guardsmen fired approximately 67 rounds over a period of 13 seconds, killed 4 students, wounded 9 others. One of them suffered permanent paralysis. Some of the students who were shot were protesting against the Cambodian campaign, which Nixon told the United States about 5 days earlier. The other students who were shot were just innocent bystanders who were just walking nearby or observing the protest from a distance. And there is Marianne Vecchio. She was 14 years old. She was a runaway from Orlando, Florida, who somehow ended up in Kent State. And this picture was taken by John Lito, who was a student there working for the student newspaper. The initial picture that came out did not have the background there. The background picture was released later on. This is a Pulitzer Prize winning picture. and the picture of 1970, obviously, and maybe the picture of the 1970s. At that point, she's screaming for help. He's obviously dead. She's in the wrong place at the wrong time. He's in the wrong place at the wrong time. She goes back to Kent State on anniversaries, whether it's, and this year is the 50th anniversary. She was supposed to be there, but there was no anniversary. She was there at the 45th and 40th, talking about her experience at Kent State as a runaway. And she wasn't a student there, she just got there. Students were angry and they wanted to launch an all-out attack on the National Guard, the faculty members, and they were led by Glenn Frank, pleaded with the students, leave the common area. They weren't leaving the common area. After 20 minutes of talking to the students would leave the common area, and finally the ambulances would get in and attend to the wounded. The guard left the area, and they just left. Eventually, they would be brought up on charges, manslaughter, and the charges would disappear, or they would go to court. They'd be found not guilty. The shootings led to protests on college campuses throughout the United States, student strikes. 450 campuses across the country closed because of violent and nonviolent demonstrations. Some students were given the choice of pass-fail or to take your marks as is and leave it at that. I was on a cruise ship last year. It was in November, and I was talking to a guy who was from upstate New York, and his wife was there, and his wife was deaf or lost most of her hearing. She was telling me, she said, I heard you clear across the room because I was watching you. And he was telling me that he had a friend in the New York State National Guard. And he was telling me that he asked the friend, if Nelson Rockefeller, glad you asked that, or told me this, get back to you on that, Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of the state of New York, he said, if Nelson Rockefeller told you to shoot to kill, would you shoot to kill demonstrators? And his friend said, yes, I would. And the guy said, well, we are no longer friends. 49 years later, the guy still had not talked to his old friend who was in the New York National Guard, who would have shot at protesters if directed by Nelson Rockefeller to do so. That is Buffalo, New York. Speaking of Nelson Rockefeller, that is the Buffalo City Police, and they're ready in their riot gear of 1970 with their rifles to go after protesters on Main Street in Buffalo. After the Kent State killings, thousands of people marched down Main Street in Buffalo. Again, the protest, the Cambodian invasion. High school students joined in. There were club-swinging Buffalo police who also fired tear gas. Rocks were hurled through bank windows by the demonstrators. Students repeatedly gassed. On November 7th, 1970, the student union, police got in there and filled the student union at SUNY Buffalo with tear gas and bird shots. 4 students were wounded. High school students were involved in the Buffalo demonstration. Why? Well, those who were graduating in 1970 faced the draft board. Those who were going to graduate in 1971 had 1 year to go, 72, 2 years ago. I graduated in 1973, which would have been 3 years to go, except I was a year ahead, didn't graduate to 1974, or I wasn't supposed to graduate until 1974. So I was a year in college already, and that would be 4 years down the road for me. I do remember in Rockland County, not far from the Ramsey Library, down Route 59, every Saturday morning by exit 14 on the thruway, there was a group of people demonstrating against the war in Vietnam. So the high school students had a stake in this as well as the college-age students who were taking part in this demonstration in Buffalo. That is the University of New Mexico, and if you take a close look at that picture, these 3 people are running away from the New Mexico National Guard. David Cargo, who was the governor of New Mexico at the time, called up the National Guard and got them to the University of New Mexico, mainly based on some faulty information. Faulty, let's leave it at faulty. That was May 11th. 11 people at the University of New Mexico were bayoneted by the New Mexico National Guard in a confrontation with student protesters. The Governor Cargo called in the National Guard, which had been given false information by the state police that the protesters, and take a look at the protesters here, were armed and dangerous. These three do not look armed and dangerous. Look at that guy's pants on the right side. Look at that, light stripes and dark stripes on the right side. That is Wall Street, and that's in front of Federal Hall with the financial district in Wall Street. And that's got to be Danny Meehan with the WMCA microphone. For those of you of a certain age in the New York area, you'll remember the good guys at WMCA 57 on your dial, which included Dandy Dan Daniel and B. Mitchell Reed and Jack Spector. Look out, Street, here I come. Top 40 radio stations like WMCA used to go out and cover news. Every radio station used to go out and cover news until about 1981 when rules changed and you didn't have to cover news. Anyway, this is a demonstration that was organized by Peter Brennan, and it's called the Hard Hat Demonstration. Impeach the Red Mayor, the Red Mayor being John Lindsay at the time. And John, I owe part of my radio career to John because down in Nyack in 1978, he gave me a scoop. He was running for Senate in 1980 in New York, and NEW Radio called me. Can we have that story? Sure. How much you gonna pay me? $10 sold. And I was on WNEW between 1978, when I was 21 years old, and 1981. Anyway, the hard hats, construction workers, all with their American flags, love it and leave it. The Archie Bunker type characters that Norman Lear was watching were demonstrating and trying to get a riot against the demonstrators. And if you see in the front, there are little kids in the front that could be hurt if something broke out. So it's Federal Hall, and the demonstrations held in reaction to the Kent State killing with a counter rally of pro-Nixon construction workers who were organized by Peter J. Brennan, who later became the United States Secretary of Labor, and it was called the Hard Hat Riot. But nobody was really injured, just a lot of screaming and yelling at that place. And there he is. There he is. Dick Nixon meeting with the protesters. Richard Nixon was having a rough go of things at this point, and Richard Nixon decides he wanted to see just how difficult it was outside. He has this news conference on Friday night. It's May 8th. He stays up until 2:15 in the morning making phone calls, sleeps a couple hours, wakes up, gets out of bed, puts on a classical musical album, Rachmaninoff, and then goes over and looks out the window and sees the gathering crowds on the mall. And he's thinking, and he's thinking, and he's thinking, and he comes up with this idea. He's going to take his valet, who is a Cuban immigrant by the name of Manolo Sanchez, and they're going to go down to the Lincoln Memorial because Sanchez has never seen the Lincoln Memorial lit up. Now, I find that hard to believe in the winter if he was the valet. But anyway, so this is the story. Manolo Sanchez needs to see the Lincoln Monument looking like that. Hey, why not? So Nixon decides, yeah, we're going to go out. We're going to go see that. And he calls up his Secret Service detail and says, boys, we're going out. Where are you going? Going to the Lincoln Memorial. What? Okay, so they follow protocol, and Nixon, by 4:35 in the morning, has an opportunity to provide Manolo with an opportunity to see the Lincoln Memorial. And just, you know, the kids are hanging out. They're getting ready for this big anti-war protest. Remember, there was an anti-war protest back on November 15th, 1969, of which Nixon said that I saw it. He did see it, but under no circumstances would he waver from what he was doing in Vietnam in 1969, just 6 months earlier. So they hatch this plan. They get in the car, and the small party leaves the White House in darkness around 4:35 in the morning. They get there, and Sanchez is looking at the monument, and Nixon sees the kids, and obviously he's going out there and he's going to talk to the kids. So he starts to talk to a small group of protesters who were camped out for the rally that was going to later in the day, staged later in the day. And if you knew anything about Richard Nixon, and this is my experience with Richard Nixon was not one for small talk. He was not one for small talk at all. It just wasn't in him. I mean, he was Richard Nixon. Let me say this about that, which was Nixon. But he tries to get some dialogue started with the people who are camping out, waiting for this big rally. And Nixon was talking about how he got the conversation going by asking how old they were, what they were studying, the usual questions. Several of the students said they attended Syracuse University. One of the students who was interviewed by the Washington Post afterwards said that Nixon commented on how good the school's football team was. He said it wasn't much for small talk. The student who talked to the Washington Post from Syracuse University said, I hope it was because he was tired, because most of what he was saying was absurd. Here we had come from a university that's completely uptight, on strike, and when we told him where we were from, he talked about the football team. And when someone said he was from California, he talked about surfing. Can you imagine Richard Nixon talking about hanging 10 or taking his Woody down to Surf City, where there were 2 boys for every gal? Richard Nixon talking about surfing? It just seems impossible. But Nixon was talking about surfing. And there they are. The students later in the day impeached Nixon in the Fourth Reich. And Nixon could peer out right from the front of the White House to see the students and the other demonstrators gathering. Nixon's rambling dialogue covered various topics, from travel and marriage to race relations to pollution. After all, Nixon did sign the order that created the EPA, the Environmental Protection Administration, but he eventually got around to what he wanted to talk about, explaining his actions on Vietnam, going into Cambodia, because he said he had a desire for peace. That's what he wanted, peace. I had to try to explain in the press conference that my goals in Vietnam were the same as theirs: stop the killing, to end the war, to bring peace. Our goal was not to get into Cambodia by what we were doing, but to get out of Vietnam. There seemed to be no, they didn't respond. I hope that their hatred of the war, which I could well understand, would not turn into a bitter hatred of our whole system, our country, and everything it stood for. I said, I know that probably most of you think I'm an SOB, but I want you to know that I understand just how you feel. And he goes to the Capitol building afterwards. Very strange. He wants hash brown eggs. Hadn't had any since he was in the White House. So the president tells his Secret Service detail after he's finished with the protesters, let's go to the Capitol. And they go through the nearly deserted Capitol building. After all, it is a Saturday morning, and Nixon's a tour guide pointing out the sights in the House chamber. And then he goes to his old representative seats and he tells Manolo, go up to the speaker's platform, deliver a short speech. He wanted to hear Sanchez give him a speech. Then off they go to breakfast. He said he hadn't had any hash browns since he'd been the president, and they had a famous hash brown dish. But it was closed. The cafeteria was closed, so they had to go up to the Mayflower Hotel and eat breakfast. H.R. Haldeman is there. So is Henry Kissinger. And there is Henry Kissinger talking to the president. Not that day. By the way, Nixon's office, Foley Square, where I first met him, was the replica of that office, except he had pictures hanging behind the flags of him and Sadat, him and Mao Zedong, him and others. And there is H.R. Haldeman, Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman. And he wrote in his diary hours after the Lincoln Memorial visit, I'm concerned about his condition. He noted that Nixon's behavior that morning constituted a Wheeler's day so far. Kent State was not the only university where there was a shooting and there was deaths. Forgotten is Jackson State, traditional black college in Mississippi. Jackson State, still in business today. The May 4th coalition is demonstrating long live the spirit of Kent and Jackson State. On May 15th, Jackson City, Mississippi State Police killed 2, wounded 12 at Jackson State College, now known as Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi. 900 campuses would eventually close. 35,000 National Guardsmen were mobilized. 21 campuses occupied. 6 dead. 9 wounded at Kent State. 11 at the University of New Mexico, and more over at Jackson State. Over 30 wounded altogether. Nixon said, rather the advisor, Henry Kissinger, said of this particular crisis that's ongoing, that he felt Nixon was on the edge of a nervous breakdown. Nixon would call on the Pennsylvania governor, William Scranton, to tell him what happened. And he wanted to know why, how, and when all of this happened. And Scranton put together a bipartisan commission to find out why the campuses blew up. June 13th, 1970, it was the President's Commission on Campus Unrest, also known as the Scranton Commission, and they wanted to know about the dissent, disorder, and violence that broke out on college and university campuses across the nation. The commission issued its findings in September of 1970. They concluded the Ohio National Guard shootings on May 4th were unjust. Robert Dole would become a thorn in Nixon's side in 1970, and in a lot of people's side. Now, Robert Dole was a World War II veteran who lost the use of one of his arms, wounded in action, and he would decided that he had a problem with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, and he wanted to see it repealed. On June 24th, 1970, Dole, who was a Republican from Kansas, had an amendment to the Foreign Military Sales Act. Senate voted 81 to 10 to repeal the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. 2 weeks later, or 3 weeks later, on July 10th, 1970, 57-5, the Senate wanted to repeal the 1964 Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Second time they have done it. First time ever in United States history that had been done with any war. The Senate wanted to get out of Vietnam in 1970. Gradually, there would be a reduction of the troops in Vietnam in 1970. 40,000 troops would come home, according to Nixon, when he announced it on October 12th, 1970, before Christmas. And the week of November 10th, 1970, for the first time in 5 years, an entire week ends with no reports of the United States combat fatalities in Southeast Asia. Oh, there were other things going on in 1970. Paul McCartney quit the Beatles. Actually, John Lennon quit the Beatles in September of 1969, but McCartney put out a news release saying that it's all over for the Beatles in May of 1970. Didn't catch Elvis Presley's eye, though. And that would come back at the end of the year. The Beatles would break up officially in April of 1970 when McCartney said he left the band. The Beatles' Let It Be album is released in May of 1970. It was supposed to be re-released with new material this year, 50 years later, but the COVID-19 pandemic knocked that out. It's going to come out 2021, along with the new movie. Apollo 13. You saw the movie Apollo 13. You might remember that Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes were going to the moon, the third lunar mission. Part of this story comes from my friend Dick Hull, who lives outside of Cape Canaveral in Florida now. Dick Hull was part of the 1969 lunar mission with Neil Armstrong. He was in Australia, and he got back from the moon the videos of Armstrong going down the ladder and walking on the moon. But there was a problem with that. The videos came in upside down 20 seconds before airtime. Dick noticed the problem, and they had 20 seconds to figure it out. He was going to pull a mirror down to flip the image, His boss said, no, if you do that, I'm firing you. And the boss said, if you fire me, or Richard said, if you fire me, you're the laughing stock. At the last possible second, Richard Hull, Dick remembered, flip the switch on the equipment. He flipped the switch and straightened out the equipment. If it wasn't for Dick Hull, we might have seen Neil Armstrong go that way on the ladder instead of going down the ladder. Anyway, Dick Hull told me that it was miraculous that those 3 astronauts came back. Jack Swigert, okay, Houston, we've had a problem here. Houston, we've had a problem, is what Larry King would say later on. After being prompted to repeat the transmission by Capcom, the guy working the desk with the earphones on, Jack R. Lausmer, an astronaut, Lovell responded, Houston, we've had a problem. Not Houston, we have a problem. And there is the problem. The service module is in pieces after an oxygen tank blows up. And there are the 3 astronauts, Lovell, Swigert, and Hayes in the ill-fated Apollo 13. It launches on April 11th, 1970 at 2:13 in the afternoon. On April 13th, around 2:07, and these are all Eastern times, a second oxygen tank explodes within the service module. It causes issues with other oxygen tanks. After 3 hours, the oxygen storages are gone, loss of water, electricity, and propulsion system. And the NASA astronauts are getting to, or rather the NASA astronauts, along with the people on the ground, are getting to work to try to save this mission and get these guys home. The command module's normal supply of electricity, light, and water all gone. The crew 200,000 miles from home. That's Deke Slayton there. Deke Slayton was the guy who's choosing astronauts, and he's talking to the people on the ground about what might be done to help these guys out by putting tiling, these filter tiles in the lunar module, maybe to get them home safely. Dick Hull told me they had about 30 options to bring the guys home. And he said they rated them 1 through 30, 1 being the best, 30 being the worst. The mission they chose was number 30. They thought with number 30, the least likely way of getting them home, they'd get them home. They weren't sure about 1 through 29. The crew would spend 3.5 days in the lunar module. They rationed food, rationed water. It was designed for 2 men. There were 3 men in there. And they somehow would get home. The carbon dioxide levels were dangerous in the lunar module, but they put some square filters in to get the carbon dioxide stopped from the command module. And they lived in the lunar module, used the lunar module as a lifeboat. Somehow they were able to get it back to Earth. And they did. And they would land, despite the fact that there was no navigation and targeting functions. There was debris from all over the place so you couldn't see. But they used the horizon, and they were able to get back on April 17th, 1970. And they splashed down near Samoa in the Pacific Ocean. And there is Hayes on the left, Lovell in the middle, and Swigert on the right. Lovell would go on to become a movie actor in a movie, Apollo 13. Tom Hanks played Jim Lovell. Lovell would play an older astronaut in the movie, talking to a younger Jim Lovell, played by Tom Hanks. I know a guy who was golf partners with Jim Lovell, and they did a press junket of the Apollo 13 movie with Ron Howard, who directed it, and Tom Hanks and Lovell. And the guy I know said to Lovell, well, what'd you think? He said, the strangest thing was, of all the questions that people ask me about Apollo 13, there and in real life, they asked me one question, not how'd you survive, but is Tom Hanks a really nice guy? Jim Lovell, Apollo 13, Tom Hanks playing Jim Lovell. Now, the Middle East. Oh, there he is again, Richard. The Middle East, that is King Hussein of Jordan, and that's Richard Nixon. I'm going to give you a little story about King Hussein from a guy I know by the name of Bob Friedman, who taught at Johns Hopkins University, went into the United States Air Force in 1965, and I spent some time with him on cruise ships, and we got to be friends. And he told me that Hussein and my friend Bob Friedman would meet in Amman, Jordan. And Friedman went from the Army, or rather the Armed Forces, and he became an advisor to Israeli prime ministers. And he also would meet with guys like Arafat and guys like Assad and guys like King Hussein. And he was telling me that he walked into King Hussein's office in Amman, Jordan. And King Hussein was late, and he walked in with his wife. By the way, his wife originally had open-toed shoes, and she was told she could not go into the king's palace with open-toed shoes. So they had to go out and buy her new shoes so she could go into the palace, because open-toed shoes were a sign of disrespect. So Bob had to buy shoes and then wait for King Hussein. And he's looking around King Hussein's office, and he's looking around King Hussein's office, and he spots 13 pictures. 13 pictures of all of King Hussein's relatives that are hanging. And he's thinking to himself, I wonder what King Hussein thinks all the time when he walks into his office, because all 13 of his relatives, all 13 of those relatives and their pictures hanging in the office, all 13 of them died of unnatural causes. Which brings me to Black September. Here's Nixon meeting with Hussein, talking about things in 1970. In the Middle East problems in 1970, one of the few years, did not stem from Israel. This stems from an offshoot of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Black September, in Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan, and also King Hussein. And there we go. No, we went the wrong way. There we go. On September 1st, remember I told you a story about Bob Friedman? On September 1st, 1970, there was an assassination attempt against King Hussein of Jordan. And this begins the Black September crisis. Now, you might know the name Black September from another crisis, 1972 Munich Olympics, and the terrorist attack that took place against the Israeli team, 9 athletes, 2 coaches, getting killed in Germany. Same people, Black September. So this starts on September 1st with an assassination attempt against Hussein. On the 15th, 2 weeks later, Hussein forms a military government with Mohammed Daoud as the prime minister. On September 17th, Black September starts. King Hussein of Jordan orders the Jordanian armed forces to oust the Palestinian Fedayeen from Jordan. Easy for me to say. Come on, wrong way. Come on, wrong way. There we go. Black September was a conflict fought in Jordan between the Jordanian armed forces and the Palestinian Liberation Organization under the leadership of Yasser Arafat between September 16th and 27th of 1970. There were certain actions that continued through July 17th of 1971. And there is Anwar Yasser Arafat back in 1970. Acting as a state within the state of Fedayeen, or the PLO, disregarded local laws and regulations, tried to assassinate King Hussein twice, the Bob Friedman story, leading to violent confrontations between them and the Jordanian army. And that starts in June of 1970. The PLO actions in Jordan, and you might remember this, culminated in hijacking of 3 airplanes over at Dawson's Field in Jordan. It was a civilian aircraft, 3 of them, and their landings were forced in Zakar with foreign hostages taken, foreign nationals taken as hostages. They released the hostages and then blew up the planes in front of the international press. And there is Assad from Syria. The Assad family still runs Syria in 2020. On September 17th, the Jordanian army surrounded cities with a PLO presence and began shelling the Fedayeen, who established themselves in Palestinian refugee camps. The next day, a Syrian Air Force, or the Syrian force, Air Force, complete with Palestinian Liberation Army markings, intervened in support of the Fedayeen. It advanced towards Ibid, which the Fedayeen declared as a liberated city. On September 22nd, the Syrians withdrew from Arbid after air-ground offensive that inflicted heavy Syrian losses. Syria was a mess. The Israelis in 1967 wiped out their air force, but they came into this one as well, and they got wiped out again. Pressure mounted in the other Arab countries, and eventually King Hussein agreed to halt the fighting, and he and Arafat signed a truce on October 13th, which allowed the Fedayeen to stay, but they had to live under Jordanian rules, or Jordan rules, speaking of a book. And there is King Hussein, and there is Arafat after the deal is cut. The Jordanian army attacked again in January of 71. The Fedayeen were driven out of cities one by one. They ended up in a forest by July 17th, and they surrendered, and Jordan allowed the Fedayeen to leave for Lebanon, but they would go through Syria and end up in Lebanon. That is Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, president of Egypt, and there is his vice president, Anwar Sadat. He would die on September 28th, Nasser did, of a heart attack, and Sadat would be the temporary president of Egypt until an election was held, which would be about 2 weeks later. On October 15th, Sadat gets 90.04% of the vote saying yes to him, and Sadat becomes the president of Egypt, and that would change the balance of the Middle East eventually. Charles de Gaulle in 1967, City Hall, Montreal, is addressing a crowd of well-wishers in Montreal, the French president, and he starts his speech by saying, "Long live free Quebec." And that is a problem. That was July 24th, 1967. And he gives support to the Quebecois who are looking to start their own country and breaking away from the rest of Canada, the independent state of Quebec. Charles de Gaulle's statements, according to Lester Pearson, who is the prime minister today, and the airport in Toronto is named after him now, were unacceptable to people. But there was a terrorism surge going on in Quebec by the FLQ that started in 1963, and Pierre Trudeau decided to crush them in October of 1970. It's called the October Crisis, and members of the Front de Liberation de Quebec kidnapped the provincial deputy premier, Pierre Laporte, and the British diplomat James Cross. Pierre Trudeau, the prime minister, invokes the only time Canada ever did this peacetime use of the War Measures Act. The kidnappers murdered Laporte. Negotiations led to Cross's release, and the kidnappers were exiled to Cuba. Between 63 and 70, the nationalist group detonated 95 bombs. Mailboxes, the common target, the biggest single bombing, Montreal Stock Exchange, February 13th, 1969, which caused extensive damage and injured 27 people. The FLQ members had stolen dynamite from military and industrial sites, robbed banks. By 1970, 23 of their members were imprisoned, 4 convicted of murder. The movement crushed in October, and the Parti Québécois decides that they are going to organize and see if they can have a separatist movement, which would go to votes a couple of times over the years, and people in Quebec voted narrowly to stay a member of Canada and not form the independent nation of Quebec. The Quebecois has certain privileges, like that thing you're seeing there, stop arrête. It's a French-only language, except in federal installations where it's bilingual, French and English. New Brunswick is the other bilingual province in Quebec. They are French and English, and officially Quebec isn't. It's all French, not English, but English is spoken in certain parts of Quebec. The end of the crisis, basically said, no more violence, let's try to do it through political means and gain autonomy and independence. In Northern Ireland, we have what is year 2 of the resistance. Now, it was the Catholics against the Protestants. Northern Ireland wanted to either break away or make peace to stay in Ireland. Their group studied Martin Luther King and Gandhi and get your means across with nonviolence. Try nonviolence to do it. It starts in 1969. England sends in troops. They go to Londonderry to try to stop the Catholics from revolting and demonstrating. And it was only supposed to be a couple of weeks. It would end in 1998, but it really begins in 1970. Everything that revolt. 1970 to 72, there's an explosion of political violence in Northern Ireland. Basically, it was, hey, stop discriminating against us, the Catholics, and the nationalist minority. You, the Protestants, and the Unionists, and the police department in England, do us a favor. Leave us alone. Give us a little area. Leave us alone. And it would take until 1998 when the former majority leader of the United States Senate, the Maine Democrat George Mitchell, brokered the deal and got a truce in Northern Ireland. August 26th, we're coming up to the 50th anniversary of the women's strike, put together by people like Betty Friedan. By the way, Betty Friedan did not like Bella Abzug, the congresswoman, and my aunt, Pearl Berkowitz, was Bella Abzug's chief of staff. Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique in 1963, which is kind of a primer to how women didn't want to necessarily just be housewives and raise kids, but they wanted to do other things in life. By 1966, Friedan would form the National Organization for Women. Some of their demands: free abortion on demand, equal opportunities in jobs and education, 24-hour-a-day free child care centers. The march would start at 5:30 in the afternoon on 59th Street and 5th Avenue, with the rally at Bryant Park at 7:30. It was part of the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the passing of the 19th Amendment, which effectively gave most, not all, most American women the right to vote. Chinese American women would get the right to vote later on, a number of years later. But most women were able to vote in the Cox-Harding presidential election in 1920. And there is Betty Friedan, who authored that book. The strike, 3 goals: free abortion on demand, equal opportunity in the workforce, free childcare. There were other demands, equal opportunity in education as well, because the 1964 Civil Rights Act did not address that. Nixon would address that in 1972. Back in 1968, feminists had a protest, the Burn Your Bra movement, in Atlantic City at Miss America, Labor Day. That was the beginning of the Burn Your Bra movement, and that was done symbolically to show men, we don't need you anymore. This picture is from 1970. It's from the Miss World pageant in London that Bob Hope was the host of the pageant. It was at the Royal Albert Hall, and it's disrupted as 50 women hurled smoke bombs and stink bombs and ink bombs at the people on stage and at judges at the Royal Albert Hall. It's William Safire. William Safire became a very popular New York Times columnist, member of the New York Times editorial board, big-time New York Times employee. The column that people most liked was his Wordsmith column on the weekends. But people who like Safire may not have looked into his background, because I, as a journalist, totally offended by him. And the reason why is that he was trying to put a dagger in my profession. And I'll show you how he tried to do it. Back in 1969, Spiro Agnew decided he was going after the news media, particularly those news people in New York. 1970, he takes it up a notch. 1969, he's talking in San Diego about the Cronkites of the world and the Huntley Brinkleys and the Howard K. Smiths. They're no good. They're just no good. But, and that was Sapphire's words, but 1970 ratchets it up. In San Diego, September 11th, 1970, Agnew, I should do this old-time radio style. Dateline San Diego, September 11th, 1970, Spiro Agnew. In the United States today, we have more than our share of nattering nabobs of negativism. Agnew criticized his opponents and the press. The words written by William Safire, who went on as a media member as a New York Times columnist. The other writer was Patrick Buchanan, who the Nixon people picked up from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. He was an op-ed writer, and after he was done with the Nixon people, he went into TV, CNN, Crossfire, etc. The last big rock concert that ever took place was on the Isle of Wight in England in 1970. About 600,000 people attend the largest rock festival of all time. Artists include Jimi Hendrix, one of his last appearances, The Who, The Doors, one of Jim Morrison's last appearances. Chicago, Richie Havens. Richie Havens had the longest fingernails I ever saw in a human being. I went to a Belmont, the race, a Belmont party, and Richie Havens was performing there. And I got to talking to him a little bit, and I just looked at his fingernails. And his fingernails were about, went out to, well, let's put it this way. That's the end of my finger, it went out to there. He told me he picked his strings, so that's how he did it. John Sebastian, before Welcome Back, Kotter. Joan Baez, who just got off the road last year, retired 10 years after Emerson, Lake and Palmer, the Moody Blues, and Jethro Tull. Rock would lose a couple people. Jimi Hendrix would choke on his vomit, and Janis Joplin would die of a heroin overdose in 1970. And Jimi Hendrix choked after taking some drugs. Sesame Street. I have a grandchild now. I want to show her Sesame Street one of these days. And so Sesame Street starts on November 15th, 1969. But there are some people in Mississippi that just did not like Sesame Street. And they moved to get Sesame Street off of Mississippi Public TV. And that's problematic in itself, because if you're in Gulfport, Mississippi, which is about 50 miles east of New Orleans on the Gulf of Mexico, and in that area, your television comes not from Mississippi, but it comes from New Orleans. If you're over at Biloxi, you're close to Mobile, Alabama, and some of your TV comes out of Alabama. If you're up in the northeast part of Mississippi, and it's right over there against Alabama, you're up against Memphis, and your PBS comes out of Memphis, Tennessee. So even though there were some state legislators who wanted to get Sesame Street off of TV in Mississippi, it was going to prove impossible unless they could tell the people in Alabama and Louisiana and in Tennessee, we don't want Sesame Street on your PBS channel. Now, the reason why that the state commission voted to ban Sesame Street, simple, had a highly integrated cast of children. They found it offensive. McSorley's in New York City. I don't know why any woman would want to go into McSorley's. The place stunk and it had sawdust on the floor, but women wanted to go into McSorley's restaurant. It was the oldest Irish tavern in New York City, founded in 1854. No women inside until 1970, when Betty Friedan's group, the National Organization of Women, sued them for discrimination. McSorley's did not want a lawsuit. And they said, you know what? Come in and smell the place and walk on the sawdust. We don't care. So women were allowed to go into McSorley's in 1970. The Chicago Seven are back in the news in 1970. They, of course, left over from the Democratic Convention in August, September of 1968. They were all arrested for inciting rioting, et cetera, among the people in there, Abby Hoffman in there, Rennie Davis in there, and a bunch of others, Jerry Rubin. In February 1970, all of the defendants are acquitted of conspiracy, but 5 of them are convicted, inciting a riot. They're sentenced to 5 years in prison, given $5,000 each in fines, and on appeal, the verdict is overturned. Howard Cosell. I am friendly with Howard's grandchildren, Colin and Justin. I had a relationship with Howard. Howard was a big guy, just in case you didn't know. Howard was 6'3", former Marine sergeant. Anyway, Monday Night Football, which is, I believe, right now the longest running show on TV, will start its 51st season if the NFL plays this year. Yeah, still that COVID-19 question. It starts in September of 1970 in Cleveland with Willie Namath and the New York Jets playing the Cleveland Browns. Keith Jackson is in the middle, Dandy Don Meredith on the right. I once talked to Keith Jackson about not being on Monday Night Football after 1970, and he said, saved my life because I couldn't keep up with Howard and Dandy Don Meredith. Howard Cosell was the attraction. 1974, Howard told me this. I looked it up. He was both the most popular and least popular man on American TV in 1974. Only person ever to do that. As Howard said to me, you do that one day. Muhammad Ali returns. Of course, Cosell made the name with Ali. Georgia. Georgia did not have a state boxing commission. He wanted to fight again. And he would in Georgia. He could fight again because the mayor of the town, Sam Mizell, was the only person who could approve or disapprove a fight if Muhammad Ali wanted to fight in Atlanta. On October 26th, after about 3.5 years in the wilderness caused by Ali not wanting to serve in the military, not even giving his name, arrested in Houston in April of 1967, faced 5 years in jail, $10,000 fine, boxing license revoked, his titles revoked, the boxing license taken away by the New York State Athletic Commission, the title taken away by the World Boxing Association. My view of that, he was stripped of his title and his license without due process. And he fought in the courts, and he was out there not necessarily protesting the Vietnam War, but lending support to the protesters. He's back. He's back. He beats Jerry Quarry. 3rd round technical knockout, and being that he's back, that would set up, there is Ali and Quarry, that would set up a possible confrontation with Joe Frazier in 1971. And there is me and Ali in 1985. Unfortunate part of that picture was the Parkinson's kicked in and all of the blows to the head kicked in, and he could barely speak. This is May of 1985. And you can tell by that TV that that picture is kind of old, really kind of old. That is me and Muhammad Ali. And that's me and Jim Bouton. Jim Bouton, that's at the Yogi Berra Museum, not far from the Ramsey Library. And in the Ramsey Library, I'm sure you got the Jim Bouton book. He lived over in Ridgewood, New Jersey. The book, Ball 4, put out in 1970, which I think is both the funniest and most sincere baseball book ever put out. And he talked about the human condition in baseball. Nobody had ever written a book like that before. In June of 1970, the baseball commissioner, Bowie Kuhn, called Jim Bouton to the office, read him the riot act, said, say whatever you said in the book isn't true. Bouton refused. I've asked him over the years, he passed away last year, how much did you leave out? He said he left a lot out. All the notes that he took for Ball 4 were auctioned off a couple of years ago, so somebody has it. And I guess somebody could write about Gary Ding Dong Bell and Joe Pepitone putting popcorn under his wig and Mickey Mantle shooting beaver. The book is published, and Mickey Mantle drinking. The book is published on June 19th. Rhodesia severs the last tie with the British Crown, declares itself a racially segregated republic, March 1st of 1970. The British Empire is slowly crumbling. Tonga and Fiji gain independence from Britain, June 4th, October 10th, 1970. That's Allende from Chile. Salvador de Mello Allende Gossens was a Chilean democratic socialist politician and a doctor. He was the president of Chile from 70 to 73. Head of the Popular Unity Political Coalition government, he was the first Marxist ever to be elected president in a democracy. That's Pope Paul VI. He's wounded in the chest during a visit to the Philippines. A dagger-wielding Bolivian painter disguised as a priest stabs Pope Paul VI. And we're just about at the end. We're just about at the end. That is the most popular picture requested from the Richard Nixon Library out in California. Yorba Linda, California, I believe. Or is that Reagan? Well, one of the two. Richard Nixon and Elvis Presley. See the flags. Those flags, part of Nixon's office at Foley Square, across the street from the Southern District Court, Lower Manhattan. Elvis Presley meets Richard Nixon in the White House. Now, Nixon had his reasons for wanting to meet Richard Nixon, or rather Elvis had his reasons to meet Richard Nixon. And Nixon probably had reasons too. After all, they were both 1950 icons. Nixon banged his shoe, or saw Khrushchev banged his shoe. He had a kitchen debate with Nikita Khrushchev. And he was the vice president at that time. And of course, Elvis became the big star in 1956. But Elvis had a reason. He wanted to get this badge from the U.S. Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. Priscilla, his wife, would later write that with the badge, Presley thought he could legally enter any country wearing his guns and carrying any drugs he wished. Of course, Elvis never played any other country except for Canada because his manager, the Colonel Tom Parker, was an illegal alien. And he went everywhere Elvis went except to Toronto and Vancouver when Elvis performed back in 1956-57. He decided, he turned down hundreds of millions of dollars in fees that he could have gotten elsewhere. But he was afraid because he was an illegal alien, he was not going to get back into the country. So Elvis never left the country. He did go to Hawaii for a concert, but he never left the country. Taking care of business. Elvis is taking care of business, and there is Richard Nixon. Presley wrote to Nixon, "I can and will do more good if I were made a federal agent at large, and I will help it by doing it my way." He wasn't doing My Way, I don't think, in 1970 quite yet. Written by Paul Anka, My Way. He also wrote the theme song of The Tonight Show. Sinatra was doing My Way, wasn't it, at that point? Anyway, he's going to do it my way through my communications with people of all ages. Elvis didn't really add too many fans after the 1950s, partly those movies he made. He did a movie with Bill Bixby and Gail Gordon, who played Mr. Mooney on one of the Lucy shows. It was all about a stock car driver owing the IRS money. And he sung a song about he's not your uncle, Uncle Sam. He owed money to Uncle Sam. Anyway, first, and that's why he probably didn't get many more fans. First and foremost, I'm an entertainer, but all I need is federal credentials. He concluded by saying he would love to meet the president. And his target were these guys: John Lennon, George Harrison, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr. Last Beatles shoot, August 1969. Nixon and Elvis Presley got along, according to everybody who was there, and Presley did get his badge. During the meeting, Presley said he felt that the Beatles exemplified an anti-American nature. They were all born in Liverpool. They were all English. Maybe Elvis forgot that after he met with them. And besides, the Beatles broke up in September 1969. Maybe Elvis was a little behind the time. But New Year's Eve day, Elvis could have caught up with the news because Paul McCartney sues the other three Beatles and Alan Klein to dissolve the Beatles partnership. So maybe Elvis caught up with the news 10 days later. So the Beatles would dissolve, as would Apple. And the Beatles would never perform again together. Three of them might, but never all four. And Richard Nixon would go off the railings in 1971. He would install a tape system in the White House, and the plumbers who broke into the Watergate Hotel in 1972 and 1971 would do their first job breaking into the psychiatrist office of Daniel Ellsberg, because Ellsberg printed the Pentagon Papers in 1971. Vietnam War would continue. Americans would go back to the moon. Thank you all so much for being a lovely audience. We can open it up for questions here. By the way, that is my Secret Service press credential from 1980. And in Mahwah, New Jersey, I interviewed Ted Kennedy, who was there when the Ford Motor Plant was about ready to close. So we can, I think, unmute everybody. I can ask to unmute. And any questions or any comments, it's your floor now. So anybody have anything to say? Please go ahead, unmute your microphones. And thank you to Debbie for inviting me to the library.
Thank you for hosting the program. It was great.
Anybody from the, now I know Captain Bob, who I met on a cruise ship. You must have something to say because you were involved there in 1970. Bob, if you could unmute yourself. I met Bob on the cruise, and I told Bob a story about my friend Harvey Schiller and Jane Fonda, and how Harvey Schiller flew missions in Vietnam, and he became Ted Turner's right-hand man after Ted Turner married Jane Fonda. And Jane Fonda would run away every time she saw Harvey. And Harvey said to her, listen, Jane, stop, just stop. He said, look, doesn't matter what you did. When I joined, he was in the Air Force, when I joined the Armed Forces, I took an oath to defend, at that time, 48 states, and the territories, to defend every American. I'm not saying that you were right. I'm not saying you were wrong. I'm just saying that you had the right to do what you did, and I had to defend you, whether I liked it or not, because I took the oath. And with that, Jane never ran away from him. They weren't friends, but she also was the boss's wife, so they were very polite to one another. And Bob was in the audience when I told that story, and he said to me, his hairs curled on the back of his neck listening to that story. And there were 4 other veterans there. And afterwards, they came up to me and they said, Harvey was a better man than we were. And they described how they protested Jane Fonda. And this is about 2016, 2017. So this was, Jane Fonda did her thing in 1972. So this was 44 years later that they were still protesting against Jane Fonda. So does anybody have anything to say? Any comments? So you could unmute yourself. Go ahead, Bob.
I don't know. I always like listening to you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, great. I didn't know this was going to work. I always like listening to you and find out what was going on the opposite side of the world when I was doing something else, and then understanding why it happened where I was.
Well, you could tell them you were in Vietnam.
Oh, yeah.
You were in Vietnam. So
Yeah.
Bob told me that he and other veterans have told me the same thing. When they were in Vietnam, they were hermetically sealed. They knew nothing what was going on back home.
That's true. We very, very rarely would hear anything that would go on back home unless we heard it in a letter from someone back there. But I guess it was better that way. You wouldn't get depressed.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you, Bob, for coming tonight. I appreciate seeing you.
Hey.
And hopefully, next time I do a talk down your neck of the woods, that I'll be in person.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Bob. Anybody else? And thank you, Bob. So I want to thank everybody for showing up. Harriet, and Eric Modell, who is there, and I don't know if other people are there as well. And I want to thank Debbie again for inviting me, and I appreciate it. And I will make this available for you to put on the library's website, because there may be some people who are still without power after 6 days after the hurricane that went through last year. So thank you, Anne. I appreciate it, Anne, and thank you so much. And thank you, Debbie. And with that, I guess it is time that we have to go. And I'm not going to sing My Way like Elvis did, but there will be an announcement very shortly that remember, E is for Elvis. Elvis has left the building, so that is what I'm doing. Again, thank you, everybody, for attending. And hopefully we will see you down the line at some point. And thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great evening.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.